Why would God bring about a 6.8 magnitude earthquake in Morocco, taking the lives of 2,900 people recently? 1 minute they're eating and drinking, and the next minute they're gone. And you see, we don't understand all of those things. Sometimes these types of ways of God, they catch us off guard a bit. I remember back early in life, I remember sometime earlier in my ministry dealing with tragedy and circumstances. I can remember even back to my wedding day when my best friend William Harrell was in my wedding. And then the very next April, that was in October, the very next April, here we are as two young preachers that are just overzealous and dreaming about ministry together, working at the same place in Atlanta, Georgia. And at lunch over Subway sandwiches, we would dream about ministry and preaching and church ministry together. And we would go out on Tuesday evenings and we would share the gospel. And that day at lunch, he said, "Hey, listen, I'm going to go to Zaxby's tonight. I'm going to share the gospel with my brother." He said, "So you need to go out with someone else tonight." And so I did. I called another friend. We went out. We shared the gospel that Tuesday. I went home, and about midnight, I received a phone call. And when I answered the phone, it was my pastor. And at that very moment, it was like I just knew. Everything wasn't right. And he told me, he said, "William never made it home tonight." He said he was on his way home. He went through an intersection. He was T-boned in the side of the car and almost instantaneously into the very presence of God. My wife and I, we got dressed. We went over to his wife's home, his now widowed wife, and with a group of friends, we tried to help her, to console her, to pray for her. And it was in those moments that we were asking questions like why. She was 10 weeks pregnant with their first child. And sometimes in the midst of those moments, you don't understand the ways of God. But yet it was almost as if we could just sense that, yes, in the midst of the pain, in the midst of the darkness, in the midst of the confusion, that God was not far from us. He was near to us. It was one of the worst days of my life. And I can remember that. And yet it's almost like the words of William Cooper's hymn, "God moves in a mysterious way, His wonders to perform. He plants His footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm." Goes on and says, "Deep and unfathomable minds of never-failing skill, He treasures up His bright designs and works His sovereign will." And then there's this line, "Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust Him for His grace. Behind a frowning providence, He hides a smiling face." The next January, my wife and I would pack up our belongings in a U-Haul truck and we would move north to Louisville, Kentucky for seminary. And we would meet new friends, and we met a man that we became friends with. His name is Chip Thornton. The next December, we came home and were visiting family over Christmas break. We met with William's widowed wife, Carrie is her name. And my wife, Carrie, talks to our friend Carrie and asked about, at this point, whether she would remarry, whether or not she had plans and a desire in her heart to remarry. She said undoubtedly she knew that she would remarry one day. And so then the story goes like this. My wife set up our new friend in Louisville with my best friend's wife, widowed, and they, in God's good providence, would meet, and then they would marry, and then the rest is history. They're serving the Lord in Alabama, in a small town, in a local church with a house full of children, because behind a frowning providence, God hid a smiling face. We didn't know it. We couldn't see it because it's God's way, and yet we were limited in our ability to discern and to understand. But get this, not just His way in the operation of the intricate details of our lives or the ordering of the steps of men, women, boys, and girls, but get this, in the salvation of sinners. Even the disciples, when Jesus walked with them, would say, I'm going to be handed over to sinful men, I'm going to be killed, and then I'm going to be resurrected on the third day. And they still did not understand it fully until the resurrection. Consider this, dear friend. Consider the ways of God, His path in saving sinners, that He chose you out of a sea of depraved sinners. He lavished you with His saving grace. He extended mercy to your guilty soul. He redeemed you with the blood of His Son, so that one day in the ages to come, He will present you faultless before the throne of our sovereign God. This is the way of our sovereign God. Consider the greatness of God confirmed. There are 3 questions to confirm this. Verses 34 and 35, for who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been His counselor, or who has given a gift to Him that He might be repaid? We see these questions coming from Isaiah and from Job. Paul quotes from Isaiah 40, verse 13. The Legacy Standard Bible reads this way: who has encompassed the Spirit of Yahweh, or as His counselor has informed Him? You just think about the President of the United States. You think about how the President always, as the leader of the free world, you might say, always has an army of counselors around him. We'll have military counselors, financial counselors, religious counselors. There are counselors all around the President to help him act in a way that is wise and good. And yet, God does not need anyone to counsel Him. He does not need to Google anything. He does not need Chat GPT. He does not need to know anything else. He does not need help in any way. He is God. He is sovereign. He is self-sufficient. He is authoritative, and He does not need to be counseled. Consider the song that we were singing, Behold our God, who has given counsel to the Lord. Who can question any of His words? Who can teach the one who knows all things? Who can fathom all His wondrous deeds? And the answer is obvious. No one. No one can counsel Him. And then, of course, we see a final question from Job. Job 41:11. Who is first given to me that I should repay him? Whatever is under the whole heaven is mine. God never goes into debt. Many of us in this room could say, well, we have debt. God has no debt. He doesn't owe us anything. He doesn't owe anyone anything. He doesn't owe us another sunrise or another sunset. God doesn't owe you the next breath in your lungs. God owes no one a thing. R.C. Sproul said it this way: if there's one maverick molecule in the universe, one molecule running loose outside the scope of God's sovereign ordination, then, ladies and gentlemen, there is not the slightest confidence that you can have that any promise that God has ever made about the future will come to pass, end quote. He doesn't need help from anyone. He controls every molecule. He is sovereign over everything. His decisions are sovereign. His decisions are wise. His ways are good. and he deserves to be praised in the salvation of sinners. We also see, second of all, the irrefutable sovereignty of God to save sinners in verse 36. For from him and through him and to him are all things. Notice that statement. This is a colossal statement. Jonathan Edwards once wrote, quote, absolute sovereignty is what I love to ascribe to God, end quote. In many ways, it's a summary of this very statement, is it not? He is absolutely sovereign over the salvation of both Jew and Gentile, bond and free, man, woman, boy, and girl, for the glory of his name. We see this. And yet, as we look at this statement, we see God is the designer of salvation. God is the architect, if you will. Acts 2:23 speaks about the predetermined plan of God. Ephesians 1:11 speaks about the counsel of his will. He is the designer of salvation. You might go into a vast building, you might look at the architecture, you might look at the stone carvings, you might look at the trim, you might look at the layout of the actual building, and you might be impressed by the design, and you might find some statement on a wall that speaks about the designer of this vast building.